Hi, everyone. Michael Cavacini here, and welcome to another one of my interviews. Today, we're speaking with Paul Duncan. Paul is a film historian whose Taschen books include the Star Wars archives, the James Bond archives, the Charlie Chaplin archives, Godfather Family Album, Taxi Driver, Film Noir, and horror cinema, as well as publications, film directors, film genres, and movie stars. He also was the editor on the Rocky book that Taschen put out. That's also
That's right.
equally impressive. So, Paul, you seem to be a very busy guy. What brought us together is the James Bond archives primarily. But welcome. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me.
My pleasure.
Just appreciate it. And I'm curious, how did you get involved in all this? I mean, obviously you've edited many books for Taschen, but when did you start, and what was kind of that first project? I guess specifically as it relates to Taschen.
Okay, well, in around 2000, 2001, I was doing a series of small books called Pocket Essentials that I started, edited, created, and wrote. And I did about 50 of these in a year. And I asked Taschen if they'd like to distribute them, because they were such great distributors. I saw their books everywhere, and I thought the only way of getting like big sales would be for Taschen to distribute them. So I approached Taschen, and they said, no, not interested. We don't distribute other people's books, which is understandable. And then about a year later, I was working as a technical author. I did all my writing and publishing, etc., in my spare time, and late at night into the small hours. And about a year later, I was technical author working in the north of England for the British government. And then I got this phone call saying, Benedict Taschen would like to meet you. So one weekend, I went across to Cologne in order to meet Benedict, and he said, "Oh, I'm looking for somebody to edit film books." And as a result of that meeting, I started doing film books on film directors, as it happened. Over there, I've got a whole pile of books that I started, and that's really where I first started getting access to archives, where you get that because of Taschen, because of the name of Taschen, because they're so well known within the art world, and for the quality of their books and their printing, reproduction. They're reproduced worldwide in multiple languages, full color. So they had a great reputation. So I would start to meet with filmmakers and archives, visit archives, and seeing things that nobody else had seen before in order to include them in the book, in the books that I was making. So that's really, so it's 20 years ago really that I started working for Taschen. That's how I got in.
That's great. And yeah, like I said, what brought us together is the James Bond archives. That is the first time I ever heard of Taschen, because I'm not necessarily in the art world, but
Sure.
obviously a big fan of books and cinema and things of that nature. And I remember seeing this book, the James Bond archives, the original edition. I'm trying to look at my website here. I think came out in 2013.
2012. It was
2012.
2012 for Skyfall.
Right. And that was, so the original edition, so people know there's kind of two editions of these books typically.
Three.
Well, that's true. Right. So there's the gigantic version, which is called like the double XL, and it weighs, it's like a 15-pound book or something crazy.
Yeah.
It's very large.
But they also do limited editions, art editions. So in 2012, we did an art edition, the gold edition, effectively, for Skyfall, and that had some prints by Ken Adam in the limited edition. that was amazing. I got to meet Ken Adam. I spent a day with him, effectively, as he was signing all these art prints and interviewing him, in effect, and at his house. And yeah, so that was the big art edition that sold out immediately. In fact, the first print run of the book, the James Bond Archives, in 2012, sold out, I think, in just a couple of weeks, and it had to be reprinted immediately before Christmas. So it was a tremendous success right from the beginning. And then a few years later, we come out with a smaller sort of trade edition, which is, all right, believe it or not, this is the small one.
Yeah, which is still heavy, right? How much does,
Oh yeah,
how much that one
yeah.
weighs?
Yeah. I don't know how much it weighs, but don't carry it in your bag. It's like, you know, you walk down the road with it, you know, you've carried it. I used to pick, because I've got so many of these, I used to pick them up with one hand on the edge to hand them over to people, right? Knowing that as soon as they took the book off me, they'd whoosh, they'd you know, the full weight would hit them, you know. But
Yeah.
so those were the, so it's the art edition, the XXL, and the trade edition, as they're called, those smaller ones. And then I did an update for Spectre. When Spectre came out, I did the additional chapter on Spectre, and then I did an additional chapter for No Time to Die, which is the blue version, which you have, and that came out in an art edition with Greg Williams photo prints, and some of those are still available, and then as well as the XXL, and now the trade edition has just come out, which you've received, yes?
Yeah, so I have the original version. So I have three versions of this book. I have the original XXL one, which is huge. But I can tell you that for people who are curious, they're like, well, why would I buy the XXL? I can tell you that the XXL one, I mean, it's very big, but actually the quality of the paper is better. So if you're into that, you know, the quality of the actual book itself is better, even though the trade one is still exceptional. I mean, you know, all things considered. Then I have the Spectre trade version, and now I have the No Time to Die one. One thing I did notice is that it looked like they had a trade version of the No Time to Die that came out around the time of the film. So am I right? Because it seems like this version is kind of a re-release of the trade version that came out previously. Am I right, or was there an update since then? I'm just kind of curious about that.
All right, so the No Time to Die, the XXL, is the blue one. So so that had the No Time to Die chapter in it, the additional chapter. And the trade edition that's just come out is a smaller version with that. It actually has a few minor changes, because the No Time to Die edition was originally finished, well, for the movie, for when the movie was originally to come out before it was delayed. So it actually has the wrong release date in the XXL. because we thought it was going to be, you know, that year. I'd already finished it. It was at the printer, and then they announced that it wasn't going to be released. So so in the trade edition, we have obviously updated the dates, you know, to make it correct, you know, so there are a few minor amendments in that way. So but otherwise they're the same. One of the things we found from comments, from what people have told me over the years, is that often they think that the big edition, the XXL, is way too large and too expensive. And they get the trade edition. Then once they have the trade edition, they say, well, I need the XXL, because they no, it's true, because there's a lot of well, first of all, there's a lot of text in there, and it's much easier to read on the XXL edition. And the other thing is that there are a lot of documents in there, and these are reproduced pin sharp. And obviously they're tiny in the trade edition, but in the XXL you can see you can read every single one of them. So all the memos and reports and script pages and daily production reports and all those sort of things, those are all completely readable on the XXL edition. So that's one of the reasons why people buy them.
Oh, that's interesting. So you mentioned a good point. A lot of times, James Bond books, magazines, things like that are released leading up to a film, almost as a promotional device.
That's right. Yeah.
Film. So for this book, this new trade edition, the No Time to Die, I went into it having no idea what the ending was going to be. So when James Bond, spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't watched it, when James Bond died, I literally was crying in the theater because I was so surprised and moved, because I thought, and it's weird, some people hate this movie. I think it was phenomenal. I thought it was well done. I thought it was just a great way to wrap up Daniel Craig's tenure as Bond. And I thought I was so emotionally invested in him and the romantic, his romantic interest, the whole dynamic, that I was just moved. And when I watched it again at home, like a year later, with my wife, she looks at me and she's like, "You crying?" I said, "Yes, I'm still crying." I said, "It's still moving." So it's still really effective. So the reason why I bring this up is because I'm curious, in the James Bond archives, do you guys get into that with him and with the other people who produced the movie about James Bond dying, why they did that, and the importance of that? Or do you not get into that because this was originally produced to promote the film, not necessarily as a retrospective?
Okay, well, always I approach the book as a historian. So I'm not really a critic or a writer when I do these books. What I am is an historian. So there are no value statements in the book. So I'm not going to say this was great or this was horrible or make any judgments on what people are doing. What it is a record of what people are doing when, and then building the story of their achievements and the problems and the barriers for them to achieve what their vision is or what the idea is, or when something goes wrong, how they're going to solve it. So there's a lot of problem solving. Now, so I want you to feel as though you're actually there as you're reading the book, that it's in the present tense. You feel that you're actually with these characters, you're with these filmmakers as they're making the movie. Now, that's easier to do on some of the older movies, from Dr. No onwards. But for Skyfall, Spectre, and No Time to Die, I am actually there on set sometimes. I'm in Pinewood interviewing heads of departments, etc., while they are filming and in the throes of solving problems. And so I've got to try and capture that, and to a certain extent, but also specifically in the case of No Time to Die, I was not told that James Bond was going to die at the end of it. What happened was I was actually involved. I read early versions of the story, of the screenplay, before they started filming. That's how early I was involved in the production, because we knew we were going to add this chapter. So I would turn up occasionally every few months in order to check in and to get updated and to get additional information. Now, right from the beginning, I saw that at the end, Bond was, there was a great explosion, and Bond, comes out the rubble, and he's knighted, and whatever the ending they put on it. But with each iteration of the script, I didn't think this was right. So I said, so this is during the production now. I said, that's not the ending. I knew, because all the rhythm of the script and the indicators all the way through had all these echoes of, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, etc. All these sort of references were in there, and I thought, no, they're going to kill off Bond, and eventually they had to. Eventually, they admitted, to me that because I was saying it, they didn't want me to say it out loud to anybody else. I mean, I'm under NDA, all through this, so I can't say it to anybody.
Right.
And then it meant that I could then talk to people about it, and them having been given the okay to talk about it. Yeah. So this is during the production. So it was a secret, and there were a lot of people within the production who didn't know that was the ending. And then even when people did know and it became obvious that that was the ending, I think it's a great tribute to the production and all the people who worked on that production, that the secret was held, for for years, in effect. And I think that's tremendous, and it gives you an idea of the loyalty that people have to the production. I mean, I never even told my wife. so when she saw it for the first time, she was surprised as well. She couldn't believe that that Bond had died, But yes, so it was. I remember talking to the production designer, and he was actually trying to work out certain aspects of that last scene, and he was actually drawing out sketches of how they were going to do it, because they just decided that he was going to go on top, and so he had to climb up, and what it was going to look like. And so he was actually, literally that day when I interviewed him, he was there sketching stuff for me, and we were discussing it. So that was really nice, that it was that I could have that experience and actually feel as though I was part of the production in a minor way.
That's
but
exciting.
Yeah, but in all the books, so for Skyfall, for example, I got that photo of Bond holding M in his arms as Sam Mendes and the rest of the crew are looking on. And the only reason I can get that is because we know that, we promise, and we make sure that the copies are not delivered or on sale before the movie comes out. Yeah.
Mhm.
So
Right. So does that mean that the latest version, No Time to Die, because I've not read that chapter yet, does
yeah.
that mean that chapter does get into his death, because did it come out?
Oh yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. So if anyone's looking for more information about the ending to No Time to Die, they can read about it in the book.
Sure. Yeah. So I always, because it's, for me, it's an historical document, so it's got to include everything. There are no
Right.
holes barred, and
That's
there's no.
great. Well, that's good, because that would be a big thing to leave out, right?
Yeah. Well, also, and his daughter as well. I mean, I had I had photos of his daughter, which obviously weren't released before the film came out. There was no publicity about it, etc. And I'd make. I mean, I'm seeing the photos, Nicola Dove's photos, as they each day, as she's coming off the set, and I'm getting access to these photos, and I'm making selections and trying to get unique images and getting them exclusive for the book as well. So that's happening as well. And I had photos, I think 5 photos of his daughter in the placed in the book. But even when I mean, I saw the the original raw files as they had them, but as we were putting them into the layout for the book, she's blurred, yeah, so that there's the copy that I got. There's no way for other people to realize what was in the photo. Yeah, so that was the other big secret in the film. So all of these things we're getting access. I mean, because we've had this relationship with Eon over, well, since 2010. I've been visiting the archives there and I'm working with them. So it's been a long time, and yeah, and it's great that I can go along and I can sit down and have half an hour here, an hour there with the heads of departments, and they're great. It's great. Even on No Time to Die, I was going into I was going into an office, into an interview, and I'd introduce myself and say, "Oh, I'm Paul Duncan. I've done the James Bond archives." And they come back to me and say, "Oh, we know who you are. We've got your book. We use it as reference." So that's really nice. It's a really nice atmosphere.
That's wonderful. One thing I noticed about this book is that when you buy it, and this is not, I think this is new to this edition, but in the table of contents, there's actually a QR code where people can scan, and it gives you access to a digital copy of the book in different languages. And I forget what the languages are, but how did that come about?
French, German, Spanish. Yeah, this is a new thing that Taschen
Yeah.
have introduced, because previously what would happen is you'd get the pizza box, right, with the and then you'd open it up and there would be a booklet inside printed in that language, in French. So if you bought a copy in France, you'd get a booklet inside in French, right, of the complete text. The book itself would be in English, and you get a booklet. And really, this is a much more efficient and let's face it, greener solution to the whole idea of doing this. I think it's a great idea. It's a new idea, and I think it's the first book Taschen have tried it out on. So we'll see if it's successful, if it works, and yeah, see if people take to it, because everybody seems to have, everybody uses their phones now on QR codes, etc. So yeah, I'm sure people will be reading it, looking at the pictures, flicking through, and then reading it on their phone as they read it. At least the text will be big enough for them to read.
That's true. And so you mentioned, speaking of the text, so this book, and by the way, for those watching, the trade version, the smaller version, is it's 8.53 pounds. So it's still substantial. It's still like a small bowling ball.
It's a little baby. It's a little baby.
Yes,
yeah,
that's true. There you go. But it's 648 pages. So, and we're talking about a lot of text on gigantic pages. So if this were like a normal book, like a hardback book, what would this be, like 2,000 pages? Like how long would this be if this is
oh sure, this is Lord of the Rings type stuff. It's really massive. I mean, I haven't done a word count on it. I don't really want to. I should. It's always expanding every time they bring out a new movie. It's always expanding. But I think that I should mention, by the way, that there are multiple authors in this book. I did all the research in the archives, and I wrote quite a few chapters in there. But it was obvious from the volume of work that I wouldn't be able to write it all, to complete it all. So I got a lot of my friends, people I knew, people I'd worked with on the Pocket Essentials, for example, 20 years ago, and basically delivered the research materials to them for them to write up certain chapters. So people like Ellen Cheshire, Danny Graydon, Howard Hughes, Jamie Russell, Colin Odell, Michel Leblanc. I'm sure I've missed out somebody. I always miss out somebody. And they all contributed following my chapters and the way that I did it. They then wrote out their chapters, and then I would rewrite in order to keep it in style. So a lot of people did contribute to this, and fair play to them. It was a great experience. And each time that we wrote stuff and completed text, it would then be sent off to Eon, to Barbara and Michael, for them to Barbara Broccoli, Michael G. Wilson, for them to read and to okay. And it was funny because each, obviously they're producers, long-standing, they've worked on a lot of the productions, and it was funny that even on some of the earlier films, the problems that they had on the early films, on Dr. No, From Russia with Love, Goldfinger, they still pop up even in the more recent productions. Problems with rats, and how do you herd rats? How do you get them? It's sort of like little stories or little anecdotes that turn up in the earlier movies. You find that they do replicate. So that was quite fun for them to go through and to read.
I'm sure. So for someone who's, I find the James Bond fans similar to, Star Wars fans and Kiss fans, and, certain fandoms are very passionate, and James Bond fans are among them. So a lot of us Bond fans, we own, DVD box sets, Blu-ray box sets. I'm sure once they release 4K box sets, we'll buy those. So there's lots of special features, interviews, documentaries, things like that are part of those special edition, DVDs, etc. So for you, is that kind of your starting point? Do you go to these documentaries and behind the scenes things and say, all right, I'm taking direct quotes from these, and that's going to be the foundation of this book, and then we're going to add to that based on my primary research? Because obviously for the current films, you're there. I mean, that's a little, you can obviously get a lot of original material. But for the older films, are you relying on those already produced documentaries and things to, I want to say fill space, because that sounds like it's fluff, but are you trying to reinvent the wheel, or are you working with what you already have?
Okay, so the process is, I go into the archives, I'm looking for materials. So in the case of all those great DVD extras that were done by John Cork and his team, those I got access to the original transcripts of all of those interviews, so that I could, not just the material that you see on screen, but the additional material that didn't make it into the special features. So these are often very, very long interviews, several hours. Some of them are a day long. And so I had all of that materials to begin with. That was, as you say, my starting point. I then took that, and then I have also all the production documentation. So often when people are interviewed, people will remember things as a story because they've repeated the story many times. And so what I was doing was I was taking the original documentation and working out what the timeline was, what the chronology was of events, putting on my history hat, my historian hat, in order to tell that story as precisely as possible. So if Ken Adam told a story and he flipped details or remembered them in an order that couldn't have happened because I have documentation to show otherwise, then I would edit that text in order to rearrange it into the correct order. And so often I did find that some people's stories didn't match up with actual events, and so I would cut those stories, whereas others I would find actual dates for the stories, and so I could place them rather than just put them in a particular way. But that's where I would start, and then there are other interviews around the world, and I mean I put them in. I create a bibliography and credit everybody for all the sources that were used. And then some of the writers, I remember Ellen said, "Oh, I found the stunt pilot, I think on License to Kill, right? And I've interviewed him, so she got a new interview with him. So, and we would contact people in that way as well, sometimes for special photos or photos that weren't in the archives or not available. So yeah, we did. That was the starting point, the archives, and then we would spread out from there when we found that there were specific things that we looked for or needed to tell the story.
Now, I'm curious because I'm writing a book myself that's historical, and so for me and for the reader, I think it's be an interesting question to get an answer to. So, like for me, I interviewed over 300 people, but then there's going to be people who I couldn't interview where I have to pull quotes from other interviews they did. So for this book, the James Bond Archives, if I recall, your book's not full of footnotes, right? So how are you blending together things that you guys get from your primary research as well as already existing? You mentioned the bibliography. So how do you present the material in a clean way where you're citing, but you're not making the citations screw things up for the reader?
Well, I don't. Well, I mean, the decision was made early on, but I remember the very first books I did for Taschen, I had all these little numbers and notes, right, where we'd put little numbers in throughout the book, and then and those would be put at the back of the book, so that people could understand where the quotes came from. And very quickly we realized that this was not visually elegant, but also there were multiple problems when it came to translations, because often the translations were different, or it had to be newly translated, and it became so complicated that a decision was made not to have those citation notes in the books, and so that became a general thing in the Taschen books. And so I also did we did the Ingmar Bergman archives like that as well. And
So what's the solution if you're not doing the all the little numbers? What are you doing instead?
we're not. Basically, we just have it clean. In the text that is sent for approvals, etc. In other words, the primary text, the original text that has to go for approval. At the end of every paragraph or line, in red, there is the source, right? So I actually have a source. I have a file with the source of all the quotes. Yeah, so I know, and I've done the same for Star Wars and Charlie Chaplin and all the other books that I've done, where I know that I know where every single quote comes from. So whether it's a John Cork interview or it's an interview that I did or somebody else did, and but that's only available to me. But I use all of those as the basis for the bibliography that goes in the back.
I got you. So for the reader, they're not necessarily aware of where each and every quote came from, but in the back, you might say, the bibliography might say that they came from this interview, or not necessarily.
Yeah. I'm just just listing all the interviews, all the books,
all the sources,
all
yes.
the websites, whatever videos, etc. that are used.
That's
And
great.
also
I like that.
and also in the acknowledgements as well. There
Right.
are certain books that are great books to read. There are major sources. I remember on Charlie Chaplin, for example, there was this guy did a tremendous amount on Chaplin's early work for Carno, and you've got to call him out and say, look, this guy's done great job, because this is not every book, right, is built on the work of all these other researchers and fans and historians and writers that have done work in the past. I'm just the latest iteration right, of all these other great people who've done work in the past, and and they should be acknowledged.
That's great. So you haven't run into any issues, or Taschen hasn't run into any issues with people saying, okay, I see the bibliography, but where did this quote come from specifically? People don't, I mean, as far as I can tell,
No,
people don't care about that, right?
well, a general reader doesn't. I mean, I do get, on my social media, I will get people saying, especially on Star Wars, when did George say this? Well, he said it on March 12th, when I interviewed him.
Right.
It's sort of like, or he said it in 1986, or because I have all that information to hand.
Yeah, I like that, because I may steal that method for my book, because I think it's cleaner and it's a lot easier than saying, in blah 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 interview, so and so said, because if you want to pull from that interview multiple times, you don't want to have to say that every single time leading into the quote, because that gets a little clunky.
Exactly. You don't want to take people out of the story. I mean, ultimately,
There you go.
what I'm doing is I'm telling a story using people's own words. So it's an oral history.
Yeah.
And you don't want people, when you see a documentary and people have been interviewed multiple times, right? You don't get a little thing at the bottom saying this was on March 5th, 1963. This was on 6th of September, 1986. This was, you just want to follow the story. You just want to keep it going. You want to keep it moving. The important thing is the story, not necessarily where the quote came from. And it's about keeping that story, for me, not only the rhythm and the context and giving it context, but also just getting it to flow and for the story to be at the forefront of what people are thinking about as they're reading it.
That's great. And so for people who are, and I love that, it's an oral history. That's exactly what I'm doing with my book, because I think people appreciate that more, right? People don't necessarily, if people want to hear people's opinions on topics, they can turn on CNN or Fox News. I feel like when they're reading a book about Bond, Kiss, wrestling, whatever, Star Wars, they're really looking for that behind the scenes factual information, kind of give me a sneak peek into how this was made and what went into it. So for you guys, you and your writers,
Can
if you
I
had
just
to,
say, can I
yes,
just interrupt you there? Because I think that it's important to remember that this format as an oral history
yeah,
gives you a sense of intimacy that you can't have in other forms. So it's very much like you're sitting down with 150 or more people who made the James Bond movies, and they're each taking turns telling their stories about what happened. And it's me as the moderator or whoever the writer is, basically saying, oh, on the 5th of September 1963, you went to so and so and you did this. Do you remember that? And he or she said, oh yeah, this happened. And they so I'm queuing up their story. That's where it is. And in order to give context for the reader. And that
yeah,
level of intimacy is very, very difficult to achieve within a book, right? And that's, if you like, the USP, the unique selling point of these books. That it's unique access to the people, to the photos, to the documents, for all of these books, whether it's Bond or Star Wars or Charlie Chaplin or Pedro Almodovar, and Ingmar Bergman. That is absolutely unique in these books, and that's because it takes so long. I should say, because it takes years, literally years of work, of research and writing and checking. That's why the books are so expensive. It's not just the production value that goes into the finished product, but you're paying for multiple people spending a long time of their lives on these books.
yeah, completely. And how much for people who are going into this book, you know, how much of it is, if you had to have like a percentage, how much of it is original writing that you guys are doing to kind of put a context around the quotes, and how much of it are quotes from individuals? Like, so if you have a chapter on Dr. No, Goldfinger, whatever it is, would you say it's like 90% thoughts from the people who were there working on the book, and maybe 10% is an introduction from you guys or something like that? I mean, how much text is around the actual
Yeah,
commentary from the people?
yeah, it's probably between 10-15% is commentary, but it's not commentary in the sense it's information. So this is based on, everything has to be fact checked. I
Mhm.
remember we did on Star Wars, for example. I remembered a chapter that I got back, and a friend of mine had written it, and he made a comment that this was, the screenwriters. It was a great example of how the screenwriter had changed the script or polished George's script. And so I went through and had a look, and I said, okay, well, let me check the script beforehand, the draft script. And the line was actually George's line. It hadn't been changed or whatever. So I had to change that. So there's a lot of that sort of work in the book in order to make sure that the facts are facts. So On Eon, no. I mean, I still get Eon still contact me occasionally because they want to, see if I can remember, or did I have information on something. That attention to detail is very important to me, because I want these to be definitive histories in many ways, or as definitive as we can be, without messing it up too much, because nothing is ever perfect. There are always mistakes in these books, and we just hope that if we find them out, we just get the opportunity to correct them, like updating the release date of No Time to Die.
Exactly. And one thing that surprised me, so for anyone who's watching this, make sure to go watch my video of where I page through the latest version, the No Time to Die version of this book. And I must have not opened my previous James Bond archives for a while, because as I was talking about it, I was like, oh yeah, this book doesn't include Never Say Never Again and Casino Royale from 1968, but that's okay, blah, blah, blah. And then as I'm paging through it, I'm like, wait a minute, I'm wrong. They're both here. So that's really interesting, because a lot of times you have these official James Bond books,
Sure.
James Bond Encyclopedia and so many others that I
Yeah.
have, and they ignore anything that's not part of the official James Bond canon. But you
Yeah.
have Never Say Never Again, and you have the Casino Royale movie, the original one. Was that an issue at all with the Eon, or were they just like, okay, that's fine? I mean, this is like the only book that I know of that has both. That's an official James Bond book,
And Ian Fleming as well.
right?
Yeah. So my approach is, scorched earth. Let's include everything, because if you talk to the man in the street and say, oh, this book has every James Bond movie in it, he's not going to know the difference between Eon and MGM and United Artists and Universal and Fox. He's just going to say that's James Bond or that's not James Bond. So this was my argument, and luckily the copyrights, etc., had all conglomerated on all of these, because United Artists is now owned by MGM, which is James Bond, and so there was the possibility of including it, and I was very lucky in getting the okay. And it just then it was just a matter of research. I had a lovely trip to New York to meet Sam and Larry Shaw, were two of the photographers who were on the set of the original Casino Royale in the 1960s. So I was very, very lucky in order to go across and to meet their family and to visit the archive. And they took me out into the countryside to the house where they had lots of met all the family and stuff like that, and telling stories. Yeah, it was great. It was so that's part of doing the books, so is you have these great experiences. And then when I went back to New York, I then realized that Joseph Karoff was like 2 or 3 blocks from the hotel I was staying, and I just rang him up in one morning, and he said, pop on over. So I walked a couple of blocks to meet him, and Joseph Karoff is the guy who came up with the logo design for 007, what we now know as the 007 logo. So he was telling me all about that. So that, there are lots of nice little stories about, for me, nice little experiences during the making of these movies, these books.
And so Never Say Never Again, and Thunderball. There's this book that came out years ago. I think it was called The Battle for Bond.
Yeah.
Which
Robert Sellers.
Yeah, what a fascinating story, the whole Kevin McClory drama, which ended, finally in time for Spectre, where they could actually use the name Spectre again. I mean, there's so much history to that. Did you include across Thunderball, Spectre, and Never Say Never Again, kind of all that drama of Kevin
Oh yeah,
McClory?
it's all in there, no stone unturned. Yeah, in fact, the producers, Harry and Cubby, wanted to do Thunderball as the first James Bond movie because that was the latest book to come out, and in fact, they got Wolf Mankiewicz to write. Sorry, they got not Wolf Mankiewicz. Who's I've forgotten his name now. Who's the other writer?
Oh, the Star Wars guy?
No.
That's the director. Never seen.
Let me reference my book.
Right, reference yourself.
Yes, reference myself. That's what I should do. All right. So Richard Maybaum. All right. So while Wolf, what they did was they got Richard Maybaum to write a screenplay for Thunderball and for Wolf Mankiewicz to write the screenplay for Dr. No. At the same time, they wanted to do Thunderball, and they actually had a meeting. This was after McClory had brought a suit against Fleming, and they were assured that the suit would be dealt with. They were assured that the suit would be dealt with very soon, very quickly. And then they had a meeting with McClory where it became clear that it wasn't going to be cleared up very soon. I mean, they had even planned a schedule and filming for Thunderball. They'd had they were going to film at Shepperton, not Pinewood, Shepperton, and they were going to go to the British West Indies, to the Bahamas. It's all, there's a breakdown, there's a script breakdown of all of this from that period. This is before Dr. No was given the go ahead. So so every detail about that is in the book.
That's wonderful. And so Never Say Never Again. I mean, one thing I'm sure you ran into as an issue is Sean Connery seemed to be the most private person in the history of James Bond. Almost did no interviews. He, like Roger Moore, always did interviews. You have interviews with Timothy Dalton. Obviously, Daniel Craig's done interviews. But for whatever reason, Sean Connery was very private about it, and it kind of gave off the impression to people that maybe he was bitter about his experience with Cubby and Harry. Who knows? But you were able to include an interview from Rolling Stone for Never Say Never Again. I mean, was it really hard to find material, interviews with Sean Connery to cover his time in these films? And how'd you solve that problem?
Yeah, absolutely. It was very difficult. And what I did was I tracked as much as I could through newspapers and other interviews, and just took what I could. Generally, my interest is in process, and rather than a generic marketing interview,
Right.
which just says how great everybody was and what wonderful experience it was making it. I try to find nuts and bolts of how things are made, and that's even more difficult than people may think. Even in large interviews, the subject doesn't often come up. Even talking to Daniel Craig, I tried to get some aspect of that, which I think is a very interesting actor. And like most actors, he will have his own techniques and ways of doing things. For instance, on the set, he will generally not be with people or be with a crowd. He won't really joke around. This is not because he's horrible in any way. It's just that his process is to keep concentration. He has a certain level of intensity and focus, and he wants to keep that. Whereas other actors I've seen on set will be very affable and very easy to get on with, and then they just switch when they're on screen, when they're on camera. With Connery, he really does not discuss it very much, and I think there's only I think once or twice where he refers during this period, this early period, where he's doing a lot of very interesting plays at the same time as he's doing films. So in this period, and I think he was actually a much more interesting actor, certainly with Sidney Lumet and his films like The Hill and The Offence, which I think is Connery's greatest acting performance. You know, I think that there was more to Connery, but he's an actor who didn't really talk about it. So so when you're in a situation like that, you have to find stories from other people and their reaction to the actors, or you find documentation that that backs up stories and placement and gives you a feel of what was actually happening on the set.
And I noticed that for for Never Say Never Again, you do call out, right? You said the Rolling Stone interview, Sean Connery, like in the chapter itself. Is that because people know that he is not really known for doing interviews? So you're like, all right, it's almost like the Playboy interview with Ian Fleming in the beginning. And you feel like, okay,
Sure.
we need to say right up front where this came from because we're not going to act like we interviewed him or something. Do you know what I mean?
No, it's simply okay. So for the other chapters, they are composites where we've taken from multiple sources and we've put them together, and so I and the other authors have created that piece for that chapter.
I see.
In this case, for the Rolling Stone and for the Playboy interview for Fleming, they have come from other sources, and they are, and Casino Royale we used. I found a great piece on the making of that movie. We're just reprinting it, so it's a matter of getting the rights and reprinting as is. So it wasn't a there was no other ulterior motive. It was just that was the title, and so so it just went with it.
That's great. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, for people who are curious, it's like a 16-page spread about Never Say Never Again. So it's really fantastic for people who are interested in that. And you mentioned you get into Ian Fleming. Something I'm sure you don't get into. Maybe it's for a future book. Maybe it's a whole book upon itself. But with Bond, it's a lived on past Fleming, right? You had the John Gardner did like 15 or 16 novels, Raymond Benson, and all these other authors who've now taken on Bond. Do you think that's a book in itself, a book about the books of Bond?
Not for me, but somebody else. I'm sure others have done it and attempted it, or will attempt it in the future. But I think that there's an interesting aspect to that, which is that obviously each of these authors draw from Fleming, but have their own take on Bond. Yeah. And I think there's an interesting parallel to the actors who have drawn upon Fleming and on Connery and on previous actors, and then interpreted the character in their own way, in their own unique way. And I think that's something to remember. Often people there is not a fixed continuity. It's not like in the Marvel universe or the Star Wars universe where there is one fixed continuity. I think that within James Bond, there has been no real continuity, or very little continuity, between the movies until really Daniel Craig. So I think that it's the way I approach the movies is that I think of them as interpretations. I have no. I think it's really interesting that Daniel Craig has chosen to do, as he told me, by accident, more by organic accident rather than by design, created this arc of 5 movies, and which now reads more like a serial rather than a series. And I think it's interesting that a lot of the, if you like, criticisms that I read online about Bond, often it falls down to that idea of the serial, in that they would prefer it to just be an adventure with no, if you like, with no psychological insight into Bond. So, because that's uniquely what Daniel Craig brings to the character. Although it is there, if you have a look at, say, Timothy Dalton in License to Kill, which is a tremendous movie, it is not. That's probably the most overt of the other movies, and also parts of other movies as well. You see it, but even when you go back to Connery, I always remember there's the scene on the beach in Thunderball where Bond is with Domino, and there's a point where he has to tell Domino that she is that her brother is dead, effectively, and that and the background story on the beach. And if you look at that scene and how it plays out, what Connery does there is, before he tells her, he puts on sunglasses so that she cannot see his eyes. Yeah. Now, I personally, I think that's Connery reading the moment and understanding that this was a delicate thing, and it was a moment where Bond cannot show emotion, and so he hides his eyes. I mean, that's how I, if I had the opportunity to speak with Sean Connery, I would certainly have asked him about moments like that do occur in his films.
Mm-hmm.
And I think these are moments where actors understand the character and try and show the character and how they're thinking and what's going on inside, even though the script and the direction is not overtly about the psychology of the character.
So you mentioned Sean Connery. So he died in 2020. So did you try and reach out to him or get in touch when you first started working on this book to see, hey, is there a chance that we could talk? And what happened?
Yeah, I mean, I did try and reach out to various people at a certain stage, but once I had 1 year looking at 1 million photos, and I had a year going through a warehouse full of documentation. So at the beginning, I had these plans to reach out to Connery and everybody else in order to do this book, because I thought it would have been a unique opportunity, a unique moment to do this. But once it became clear that I would be overwhelmed with work and I needed to get other people on board, then it just became a time crunch, and it just couldn't happen. So even though the intent was there at the beginning, the reality soon put paid to that.
So now I'm curious, so did you actually wind up reaching out at all and get either no response or a rejection? I mean, I'm just curious if if you reached out at all, or if you
No,
decided not to reach out.
no, I got contact details for his agent, but by that stage I had decided that I just didn't have the time. I
And what
just
about, sorry, I was just going to say, so for future editions of the book, because obviously the first one's probably the hardest, right? Because you're creating something from nothing. It doesn't exist yet. But when it came time to do, I guess, Spectre, um,
I was on set.
okay, so the Spectre, yeah, or that's 2015. So then by that time, did you say, okay, now that the book exists and we're pretty much updating it, did you consider, okay, now might be a more reasonable time to see if we can get in touch with Sean to see if we can add that to really kind of push us over the top?
Didn't have time or budget. You know, these things are very tightly budgeted and timed. Basically, even just adding a chapter, adding 24 pages to a book, just didn't have the budget or the time for it.
Um, any regrets that you didn't? I mean, the only reason why I ask is because, like, the book that I'm working on, actually, multiple people I've interviewed have died, and
Yeah,
people who I wanted to interview have died. And I've only been working on this book for like 2 or 3 years, and I'm
yeah.
like, man, like it's crazy. So I was just wondering, as a fan, as a historian, are you kind of like, damn, if only, right? I mean, do you have any moments
No,
like that about him or others?
no, you can't think like that. You can't have regrets about things like that. I look at the fact that I did a book on Antonioni, Michelangelo Antonioni, fantastic, amazing Italian director.
Mhm.
And so I reached out and I went over to his apartment, and he was there. At that time, he'd had a stroke many years previously, and he'd lost the ability to speak English, which he had spoken previously, and just a few words of Italian. But we still communicated. But I got to spend time with him, yeah, while he was painting. So so it's not about, you can't regret things that you never did. You just got to enjoy the things that you got to do. I got to spend time on Skyfall, Spectre, and No Time to Die, on Collateral. I've gone into archives, Bergman, Almodovar. I spent time on set with Pedro Almodovar, where he's showing me around a set and explaining his thoughts on the set design, and as he's doing Broken Embraces. You meet all sorts of great, intelligent, funny people while you're doing this. Archivists. It's not just stars and things like that. It's all the people behind the scenes as well, who are great fun, have a
Yeah.
laugh, and explain themselves. So no, I've met a lot of great, fascinating, extraordinary people. Real artists, people at the top of their game. People who've won Oscars. I had one day when I had 5 days talking with George Lucas over 2 years, which is pretty incredible. And I remember one day I was at the Presidio in San Francisco at Lucasfilm, And so I'm talking to John Knoll, who special effects, VFX, co-creator of Photoshop, um, uh, and then have a chat with him, and then in come Dennis Muren, another Oscar winner who'd done all this fantastic special effects work, and then in comes Doug Chiang, one of the greatest production designers and concept artists in the world. And when you have days like this and you meet these people, no, there's no regrets about not meeting other people. It's just taking joy in the people you have met and experienced.
That's a good perspective to have. So aside from Connery, obviously you've interviewed Daniel Craig multiple times. Did you get a chance to interview any of the other Bonds in producing this book?
No, I never attempted to, because I had so much material already. People
Mm,
have done so many interviews, etc. And also, um, it it's just crunching. It's crunching time. You imagine we've got more than 150 people in the book, and that was another aspect of the book which I thought was important. As I was making the book, as I was beginning to understand what the book was about, because I didn't know what the story of the book was or what my take on it was going to be when I started, which is always the same on new projects. I never know what the story is going to be. I have to find the story. Um, I realized that it was a family concern. It was Broccoli and Saltzman, and it was Barbara and Michael, and now Greg, and now I was thinking, well, there's the Lamont family, the Corbold family, and all these Udell family, all these other families who worked on these movies, Powell, all these different family. And I thought, well, yeah, it is like a family atmosphere. And this is one of the things that came through, is that people look after the producers look after the production and the people on the production. I went on set, and I went to Pinewood, and I remember hearing about Barbara complaining about some of the food that was available, and she wanted better food for the crew, for the cast and crew. And so she was looking at the menus in order to make sure that it was, better food, and it was more nutritious, and etc., etc. And there was a better range, for what the crew wanted. And they're very stressed. We need somebody to go around and de-stress them, and so offering massages, and there was a rota for so there was all these sort of things. And to be honest, I was there, I think, till 1 o'clock in the morning one time at Pinewood, and they were still working. It was, they were doing day shifts and night shifts, getting things, working on things. So these are, it's incredibly intense and very tense, working on the difficult conditions, and everybody wants to keep going and do the best job that they can. So that sort of family atmosphere and that inherent drama of making a movie. Remember, they've made all these Bond movies. There has been no guarantee ever over 60 years that the next movie, the movie they're working on, will be successful. Just think about the tension and the drama inherent in that. So every single movie, it could, the next one, it could be a bomb. We could lose tons of money. There's no such thing as a sure thing. You think of all the other franchises that have existed, all the other films that have just gone by the wayside, because the production, the sensitivity to the franchise hasn't been there, that they've lost their audience. But Bond has kept an audience over 60 years. I think that's an incredible achievement. And I think partly because of this idea of family and continuity. And so with that in mind, that's why I included so many voices. So even though, Daniel Craig may be Bond, and even though Timothy Dalton may be Bond, and even though Sean Connery may be Bond, Peter Lamont and Ken Adam and John Richardson and everybody else who's involved in the production, I think is all part of that production. Norman Wanstall, Peter Hunt, there are a lot of people who've contributed to Bond. And I thought, let's give those people a voice in the book and show, there is, ironically, you have this sort of lone wolf investigator in James Bond, but he can't exist without this enormous team of people behind him.
Mm. And so what does the James Bond archives actually look like? What I mean by that is, when you get assigned a job like this, do you have to go to Eon's office? I'm just curious, like, are you going into a vault? Like where, or are they just emailing you a gigantic, cloud drive of all this information? Like, are you physically going through things, or are you?
Oh, yeah.
What does that look like?
No. Well, it looks like me wearing wearing comfortable shoes, walking around a big warehouse full of documents and props and artwork and everything else, and rooting through boxes, drawers, files, folders. That's physically me doing that. So that's what I do. That's because it's the only way I can, if I see everything, and it was the same on Star Wars and Ingmar Bergman and Pedro Almodovar and Charlie Chaplin. The only way of me selecting everything, of selecting what's appropriate for the book and finding the story for the book, is by me actually seeing everything. So that's what it looks like. Is in fact extremely meticulous, and it looks very boring. But it's, I mean, seeing somebody just at a filing cabinet taking out a folder and looking through it and then selecting something to, oh, this may be interesting. I need a snap of that or a scan of this. Or now you can do scans and you can use your phone and do snaps. When I started, that was actually very difficult to do. But now it's much easier. But it is, and it's just acquiring all the information, all the raw materials. So you complain about the book being big. Effectively, I could do a book that size on every single Bond movie, no problem. There is enough material in existence. I remember on, was it Skyfall, Casino Royale? I think it was Casino Royale. I was asking, I couldn't. They had a separate warehouse for the Casino Royale materials, because
like for the modern Casino Royale movie.
Yeah, the modern one. Yeah, because their archive wasn't big enough to hold all the materials, because so much material, because you have all the emails and documentation, etc. They print it out and they put it into storage, because the productions now, they've got thousands upon thousands of people working on them. And so it became a matter of, I can't look through all of that. Best will in the world, I'd still be there reading it now, 10 years later, 11 years later. But I knew enough about what were important documents in order to say, right, I need these type of documents. Do you have them? Yeah. And because you learn that the important ones are really the daily production reports or process reports, daily process reports. They're under different names depending upon which productions you're on. But essentially, this tells you exactly what was shot on each day. Camera reports are good as well. These tell you what was taken on every single take. So you will have one report on each take, and then these are sent to the editorial department so that they know which every single take that they have. These are the sort of documents, once you key in to what films are and what they're about. So on the set of No Time to Die, I see Carey and the director and Linus, the DP. I see them there by their screens, you know, filming, doing everything, and then I see continuity woman. Every time there's a take, she's typing everything up, making sure all the dialogue is correct, and then emailing it each take, the documents, off to editorial so that they know what's coming down the line. So you see that process, and once you know what on the important documents, those are the things you hone in on in order to try. Whoops. Those are the sort of things that you hone in on to try and get access to, in order to help tell the story that that you want to find in the book.
Wow. So out of curiosity, how many warehouses does Eon have to house all of this Bond stuff? Is it just 2, or is it more? Is it like 4 or 5? I'm just curious, like, how many are we talking?
Well, there are multiple archives because I don't know. I haven't been to all of them, but I know there are multiples. And, I can't really talk too much about it because it is top secret,
True. Well, you can just give me the addresses later. I'm kidding.
All right.
No, I know you mean. It's interesting.
I'll give you the dummy addresses later, right?
Yes, but I know I've mentioned Kiss and in the past, but Kiss, I'm a big Kiss fan. They have a warehouse with all of their props and guitars and all sorts of things. And WWE, the wrestling company, has a warehouse as well, because these companies that have been around, or these brands that have been around for 50 years, 60 years, whatever, there's a lot of stuff that they collect, and fans would just love to go through that stuff because there's so much interesting material, I'm sure. So that's really fascinating. So you mentioned
but can I just say, we're going I mean, I've been to a lot of archives. I mean, I've just visited an archive that has 20,000 square feet of materials. And I say, it'll take me about 6 months to go through that. And they said, no, it won't. It'll take you much longer. But I know it'll take me 6 months. But the thing is about these archives is that they're not, you need, the thing about these books, I think, is that you've got to remember that it's a curated experience. So when you go to an archive, it's completely random, in sense of, if you were to go to visit it and the fans were to go to visit, I mean, obviously they would freak out. But to tell a story, it needs to be curated in some way, like going to an exhibition, a really well done exhibition, so that there is a story and a continuity. And that's what I'm trying to do in these books. I'm trying to find a form or a story in which to hang on all these aspects of the archive, so that I can draw out, I mean, I've mentioned this before, but the very first day I went into this warehouse, I go open the drawer for Dr. No. First folder I pick out has all these cables that was sent between Harry and Cubby, between Jamaica and London, and I pick out the first cable I pick out and I look at is Cubby sending a cable to David Picker of United Artists in New York saying, send somebody to Saks Fifth Avenue to pick up a white bra to send to Jamaica, which is obviously what will be adapted by Tessa Wellborn, Tessa Prendergast, and Ursula Andress into the bikini that we see on screen. And this is after Ursula arrives in Jamaica. So I think it's, so I know when I've seen that document, I know I have to get that document into the book. And that's what happens, is that you realize that there are certain key documents or key images that need to be in the book because they give you an extra degree of contact with the archive, an extra degree of detail about the process, and an extra degree of human interest about the movie. So that's what I'm always looking for in order to help tell the story.
And you mentioned Michael G. Wilson and Barbara Broccoli. Tell me about them, your experiences with them. And I imagine that obviously you have access to them, but you're probably working with someone underneath them, I guess, routinely if you have questions and things that need to be addressed. But just tell me about their thoughts on them and kind of that working dynamic.
All right. So, I mean, let's be clear. It's amazing that they've given Taschen and me access to all of this material, and incredible access. I mean, I've seen so many sensitive documentation, which is obviously not going to be published, but it's information that I need in order to give context for the stories that are in the book, so that I know when things happen. So that they've been really, really completely supportive of this project, which has been great. Now, over the years, I've met them multiple times and interviewed them multiple times, normally on set, and sometimes after the production has been completed. And they've been really nice, guarded sometimes, and it's actually a lovely dynamic between Barbara and Michael, because Michael is a little bit more outspoken and a little bit goofy sometimes, and he'll make little outrageous statements, right? And Barbara will say, "You can't say that, Michael. He's recording it, or he will." Yeah. And Barbara's a little bit guarded, but Michael knows that I'm not going to use it. I know that he's ribbing me, but also he's ribbing Barbara at the same time, because he knows that Barbara will react that way. So it's sort of lovely, to see that sort of relationship between them. I mean, it's very sweet, I think. And but they do have genuine problems and issues to deal with on a daily basis on the set, and they're anticipating it, what's going to happen, and it's really nice. I remember on beginning of Spectre, where where the building collapses
That's a great
onto
scene.
onto Bond and then falls. Well, that was for the close-up where you see all the rubble falling, etc. That was filmed in the back lot on at Pinewood, and so the word goes out, oh, they're going for a take, right? So everybody leaves the offices and goes to the back lot in order to walk up, including Michael. And Michael is there with his camera, right? And he's taking photos of this as it's happening, right? So even now, he's engaged and interested and thinks it's wonderful, even though he's been doing it for decades, and he still wants to take photos of everything, which I thought was lovely. And he even allowed me to, he invited me to his place to go through his archive of photos that he's taken on the set, and he took some wonderful underwater photos from Spy Love Me. He was with the Bahamas unit, the underwater unit. So he was taking photographs underwater as they were doing the model work for the Lotus Esprit as it's going through with these models underwater. And so, yeah, he let me look through all those sort of materials. And so that was great. So I think that, you know, the relationship has always been really wonderful with them. Obviously, there are things that will happen over the course of a production, and you think, well, do I want to include that? Do I not? Is it important? Is it not important? What's good for the story? What's bad for the story? And sometimes their perspective, you know, they will tell you something that allows you to see something in a completely different way. And that's been really good. I remember on GoldenEye, there was a moment when they were going to film the big tank chase in St. Petersburg, and they realized that they couldn't, for some reason, I don't know why, but the people in St. Petersburg weren't keen on a tank going through this historic center of St. Petersburg, destroying buildings. You know, I can't see why that would be a problem, but apparently it was. And so they realized that a lot of the shots would they couldn't do it. And Barbara and Michael wrote a document which they found for me so that I could include in the book, which actually gave the outline of how they could do it and how much it would cost and how much money it would save, right? Which is ultimately the job of the producer, is to get value for money, to get the job done, and to see whether you can get it done any cheaper. And so it's solving a problem. And it was great because, you know, they said, look, this happened and we have a document that, you know, so they found that document for me, which was wonderful. So it's always about this showing a new perspective into different areas of the production, which I think is great.
Yeah, so and Michael's been in multiple Bond films. I spot him now when I'm watching them back. Oh, there he is.
Yeah. Yeah, he's this dictator who gets arrested, or he's on the board, you know. Yeah, he's the he likes it. He enjoys it. I think he was one of the extras on Goldfinger, and I think he got the bug from that.
That's great. So the book is not only great text and commentary from folks who were part of these films, but it's also a lot of great photography. And you mentioned his underwater photography from The Spy Who Loved Me. So are you the one selecting the photos and laying them out, or is your team, or is there someone who's like in charge of that as part of this project?
No, I'm selecting all the images. I'm laying them out. I work with um, a designer, but generally, um, I, I would say 70, 80, 90% of what I select is, and how I lay it out is about right. So, I mean, I've been doing it a long while. So yeah, so that's me, most of it, some of it.
Yeah, that's great. So I guess.
And you've got to remember there's
Mhm.
hundreds more images that I want to include but cannot. So that's always the difficult thing, because you have to balance between the iconic images that are needed to tell the story to go full page,
Mhm.
and also images that are information, images that are behind the scenes, that gives some emotion to the story, uh, and also documents, storyboards, production artwork. uh, you know, all of these, they have to be balanced within the book. And also another aspect is that I try to show, with each chapter, I try to highlight a different craft within the making of the movies, so that um, so that over the course of the book you get some understanding of the different crafts involved in James Bond.
Yes, absolutely. And yeah, the photography is wonderful. My favorite photo is the one that opens the book with Sean Connery leaning against
Yeah,
the car. When I believe that's from
the
Goldfinger.
SMR,
Um,
Goldfinger, Furka Pass. Yeah,
yep, that is the best image when I think of Bond. And like, yeah, that's it, right? And that just kind of embodies everything about the character and the
yeah.
movies. But obviously, we've spent like this whole time talking about Bond pretty much. But yeah, obviously you've worked on the Star Wars archives and the Rocky book. I have a few questions about those. I don't want to keep it too long. But so the Rocky book, when are we getting a trade version of that? Because that book is so expensive and I would love to have it, but I'm like, I'm not spending $2,000 to get a book about Rocky. So why hasn't, I
Why
mean,
not, Michael? Why not? Give me
it's a
one
book
good
about a
reason.
blue collar character. You would think between Bond, who's high end and classy, and Rocky, who's blue collar and, kind of poor, they would have the Rocky book be the trade paperback, not Bond. It just seems kind of.
You're so reductive, Michael. So reductive. No. But it's made millions. Um, well, I mean, from a purely practical point of view,
Yeah.
how Taschen work is that they do the big expensive books, the art editions, etc., and then when they sell out, which could be a year later, 18 months later, or 6 years later, then
Mhm.
they bring out a trade edition. Um, so that's really where it's the waiting game. Hopefully, it did take many years for us to get a trade edition of the Taxi Driver book,
Mhm.
and that came out in a smaller format and has never been reprinted. So that's another aspect, in that a lot of the books that do are uh, come out and maybe a single printing, and yeah, so I have no idea when the smaller Rocky book will come out. There are no plans for this, I can say at the moment, but when they do come out, you need to pick them up because they don't hang around forever. For instance, um, I'm just looking around here. I've got a Michael Mann book that I did a number of years ago, and that sells for a few $100s now. It just came out in one edition. one printing, never been reprinted. And so that's the sort of thing that happens. So, and also there's no guarantee that there will be a smaller Rocky book, I should say.
Right. I mean, so when did the Rocky book come out? Do you remember what year that was?
Oh gosh, I'm thinking 19.
Okay, right. It was recent. Yeah,
Yeah,
relatively.
it was relative 4 years ago. Probably, yeah, it was probably about 19
Right.
and 18, 19. And yeah, and that was when I think Creed, it includes Creed as well as all the Rocky movies, it includes Creed. And I think Creed 2 was in production at the time,
Mhm.
but not out. So we didn't have access to the materials for Creed 2. So if a reduced version, if a trade edition did come out, I would ask whether Creed 2 would be in there because Rocky is in it. And obviously there's a Creed 3. So but I don't know, I have no idea what will happen in the future. But
Right.
those are the sort of discussions we would have in the future.
Right. Well, I hope it does, because I think it would. I think it would sell really well because I mean it's Rocky, right? I mean Rocky's another one of those franchises that just continues to endure, and if it were $80 or whatever the price would be, I think that it would, people would definitely buy it.
Yeah.
So hopefully, fingers crossed that happens. But what was that experience like working on the Rocky book? Did you have access to? I mean, I know Stallone doesn't own the rights, and that was the whole thing. But did you? But he signed copies of these books. I mean, did you have access to him? What was that like?
Yeah. So for that book, that was similar to the Taxi Driver and Godfather books in that they are primarily photo books. So what we're doing is we're telling the stories through the photos. Uh, So for each film, say for Rocky, the first movie, there will be the story of the movie told through the unit photography, and then there will be articles on the making of and interviews after that with the behind the scenes photos with those, and then it's repeated for each of the Rocky movies. And I don't do new interviews or new materials. I take historical materials. Now, my relationship with Sly on that is that um, I sent him. I was emailing with. I met Sly once, um, and I got him to. And we were in email contact, and I basically sent him my ideas for which articles and interviews would be most appropriate for each of the movies. We'd have a back and forth, and then and so he helped with the selection process on that, and obviously he signed them all, and yeah, so it was fairly simple from that point of view. For the photography itself, it's MGM. MGM, I had a relationship through James Bond
Mhm.
with MGM, who owned the United Artists uh, catalog and have all the original materials. So it was lovely going to their offices and them pulling all their Rocky boxes with photography and going through all the photography and bits and pieces for that. So yeah, it was yeah, it was good fun. Yeah, and
That's
they also have their materials are housed or kept by the Academy Library, the Academy Museum as it is now, and so I would visit the Academy Library as well in order to get access to all their materials there. So
yeah,
yeah, they give complete access. It was great.
that's good. Yeah, anyone watching, I did get a chance to actually see the Rocky book recently for the first time, and it's beautiful. It's really well done. So anyone, it says on Taschen's website, there's few left, so go buy
Yeah,
it so that way they can release the trade version.
Yeah.
um,
It's just for you, Michael. You're encouraging others to buy it. Yeah.
right.
You
Yeah.
should go to the Taschen store and just do a video in the store in order to encourage people to buy it, so that you can have your trade edition eventually, Michael.
Eventually, yes. So the Star Wars, I guess we'll end up at the Star Wars archives. How does that book compare to the James Bond archives and the Rocky, the complete films? Is Star Wars archives more like the James Bond films in its
Yeah,
presentation? What was that creation like?
yeah. I mean, it's very similar to James Bond, but there are fewer movies, and so that involved, and there are 2 books. So the first book does episodes 4, 5, and 6. The second book does episodes 1, 2, and 3. These were all produced, written, directed primarily by George Lucas. When I started working on the project, had complete access from Disney and Lucasfilm. George, who owns his own archive and has his own resources at the Skywalker Ranch, also gave me access to all of his materials. And then I was, to be honest, it's one of, like with the Bond book, I had this sort of crisis moment. Well, I had a crisis for about 6 months, because I'm doing all this research, I'm seeing all this wonderful material, but also so much wonderful material had already been written and published about Star Wars. I grew up with Star Wars, as I'd grown up with James Bond. And so I thought I had nothing to contribute, nothing to give, nothing to make it worthwhile for somebody to spend so much money on the book on Star Wars. This is always my problem, or my issue, is that I feel very guilty about having so much fun in these archives, researching, looking at this stuff. And then there's a certain amount of time, there's a certain point in this whole process where I am, just getting really stressed out, because I don't know how to convert all this into a story that's worth telling, that will justify people spending $200 on a book. So that's a real issue for me. Then I thought, well, the story I haven't heard, or the story I want to hear, is George Lucas telling that story of creating Star Wars and directing Star Wars, and what it was like for him. And then once that idea clicked, I then asked George. I went through his office and said, would it be at all possible, pretty please, can I maybe talk to you? And the response was, which day do you want? And I thought, a day? Oh my goodness, a day. And so that's what happened. I had a day with George, and at that stage, all 6 movies, episodes 1 to 6, were going to be done in a single book. And so the onus became on me to meet with George and talk to George, and try to have a conversation with him that would be engaging for him, because he's been interviewed hundreds of times, and it was a matter of trying to find a way of keeping him interested. I mean, I failed on some occasions, but the more we talked, more we talked about Joseph Campbell, the hero's journey, Hero with 1,000 Faces. The more we talked about the mythology of Star Wars, midichlorians, the Wills, the Sith, the Rule of Two, all these sort of and the actual process of making the movies, it became easier. But what he wanted was a conversation. He didn't want a Q&A. He wanted us to go back and forth. And even though there were longeurs occasionally where he either didn't answer a question the way I thought he was going to answer it, or really it didn't lead anywhere, and I was sort of in a dead end, I was thinking, oh, I've got to think of another thing now. I've got to think, otherwise there's dead air, there's dead space. But after a day, I thought, well, I think maybe we could do another, would it be okay to do another day? Yeah, sure. And I was there on the ranch doing research. So I had another day, a week or 10 days later. And then then it was at that point that I thought that we should split it into 2 books. And then once that became clear, I then had other interviews for other days over 2 years. And then George said, oh, I should interview so-and-so and so-and-so. And then I would interview other people as a result of that. So, but it's an oral history the same way as James Bond. It's in more detail because we've simply got, if you've got 180 pages on a single movie, you can go into a heck of a lot more detail about the processes of making the movies. And so it really allowed me to develop a better storytelling form because I knew I had multiple threads. There's not only the chronology going through it, but also there's George's story of becoming an independent filmmaker and getting his vision across. You've got the hero's story. So if you like, the subtext of Star Wars, which I'm putting in at opposite moments during the story. And then you've also got the story of technology and how he is advancing technology, first with motion control cameras and optical printing for episodes 4, 5, and 6, and then the whole digital technology and the digital world that we're living in now. The fact that to make this, you have digital audio and visual, you have cameras that are taking a pixel in, holding it digitally, you can edit it digitally, you can do image and sound separately digitally, and then you can project it digitally, right? That world did not exist before episode 1 of Star Wars, but that was George's vision, if you like, for the future of technology and the future of cinema. So, and that whole story is told in that second book, episodes 1, 2, and 3. So these are all the different stories, if you like, the threads that I'm weaving like a braid through these books. So yeah, it was great. I'm really proud of the work that I did there.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And I guess just to wrap up here, so James Bond, despite us talking about Star Wars, Rocky, and all these other franchises, it's been said that James Bond is the longest running and most enduring and successful film franchise of all time. That's got to be indisputable, right? I mean, considering there's 25 films, Skyfall alone made billions of dollars. You have all this merchandising, you have all these novels. I mean, it's a juggernaut that's actually bigger than Star Wars, right?
Oh, I'm not going to answer that question. It's I don't know. I don't know the final figures. But you've got to remember the Fleming estate is separate to Eon. I don't know. If you adjust for inflation, I think yes. If you're talking about number of movies in a franchise, there's actually another franchise in Japan featuring a rickshaw man, which has more entries in it, directed by Yoji Yamada. So there are, if you like, but I think if you could say James Bond is the king of the franchises, or the gold standard of franchises. I think it's indisputable that if anybody wants to start a franchise, they have to look to Bond. You know, they have to look to Bond. They have to say, well, can I do that? Can I continue not just 1, 2, and 3, but can I get to episode 25, 26? And who knows, what's going to happen with Bond in the future. There is no guarantee, as I said, that everything they do will be successful. So all this, and I think that this is where all the speculation about franchises, this is where it comes from, because there is always a delicate balance between what people have seen before and what people expect from a franchise and what they're going to get in the future. I think one of the bravest things that George Lucas did on episodes 1, 2, and 3 of Star Wars is that he actually said, no, let's not give people what they expect. Let's tell a different story. And so that was, for the time, was extremely shocking to do. And I think what's interesting with Bond recently with Daniel Craig is that they've taken that approach. They've said, okay, like Jason Bourne, having a through line through the stories, let's actually give Bond a sort of through line, a psychological through line through the stories. And I think it makes it a much more engaging and psychologically true version of Bond, which actually is, I feel, is much closer to the original novels. In the novels, Bond was essentially falling apart in the last few novels, and I think that the Craig Bond captures that brilliantly.
Absolutely. Yeah, it'll be very interesting to see the future of Bond in all mediums, not just cinema. So thank you for your time. This has really been a great discussion, taking a deep dive into the world of James Bond and touching on Star Wars and Rocky as well. It's been great, and just appreciate it. And everyone, please check out Paul's books. They're available on Amazon. The special editions and extra large versions are available at Taschen's website. And these books are not available for long, right? They're not in print for a long time. So it's available now. Add it to your cart, buy it, because all of them are really high quality and well done.
Thank you very much. It's been great talking to you. Thanks for being such a good listener, Michael.
Thank you.